The November 1866 issue of the Merchant's Magazine and Commercial Review came to Captain Knapp of the Evening Star's defense. Quote, "We notice that a daily paper refers to the commander of the steamship Evening Star, which was lost off the coast of Florida on the 3rd of October, as an unqualified and inexperienced navigator. So far from this being the case, we know him to be one of the best men in the service, who, for his personal qualities and nautical skill, was held in very high esteem."
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story? The Poor Crew of the Evening Star.
Here we are. Enjoy!
The Evening Star was built in 1863 for the New York Mail Steamship Company for a route between New York and New Orleans. The 2,200-ton side-wheel steamship had a hull of solid white oak, and was described both by the company and the shipbuilders as having been designed in every way a first-class ship with careful thought being put into every detail. Her solid build would be to her benefit when on the 31st of May, 1866, she ended up on Pickle Reef off the coast of Florida. For 50 hours, she rested on the reef, but it was described that she did not grind or seem damaged by the experience. Once she was off the reef, the ship continued with her voyage to New Orleans, and even made another voyage after the incident, in which she weathered a gale without showing any signs of taking on more water than normal. As a result, it was believed that she had sustained no damage from the reef, but as a precaution, she was overhauled and part of her keel was found to have been damaged, though not in a way that caused the ship to leak. This portion was replaced, and the ship underwent inspection that found her in good order. When the ship was placed back into service in August, Captain Knapp took command of her. He had been away from the sea for some time. It was reported that the request of his wife to leave the ocean out of concern for his safety. But such an experienced and respected captain had no difficulty finding a command on his return. Once again, the Evening Star proved that she was able to weather storms while under his command, and everyone thought that even if she had been compromised on the reef, which did not seem to be the case, there was nothing to suggest that she was not reliable and safe now. Her luxurious fittings meant that she attracted wealthy and famous passengers to her first-class cabins. On the 29th of September, 1866, she departed from New York with 50 crew members and an estimated 250 passengers. It was noted later that her crew of 50 was 20 less than she had carried on previous voyages, primarily because the New York Mail Steamship Company would not pay market wages. Most of the passengers for this voyage were entertainers who were headed to New Orleans for engagements in that city. Some of them were well-known individuals, while others were members of complete traveling troupes, including the Spalding and Bidwell Opera Troupe, the Nicolo Troupe, and the French Opera Troupe of Paul Eliza, which had just arrived in the United States from France. For the first couple of days, there was nothing noteworthy about the voyage. As was common at the time, the Evening Star's steam engines were assisted by the ship's sails, and with all sails set, it was estimated that she was traveling about 11 knots. At about 3 in the afternoon on Tuesday, the 2nd of October, the weather began to take a turn. The barometer began to fall, and by 5 that afternoon they were in the middle of a powerful gale. It was nothing the ship had not weathered before, so the crew was not alarmed. Instead, they went about their tasks calmly. The canvas was taken in, and the ship was turned so that she would take the now powerful waves bow on. The second officer reported that even with this, she was not taking on water, and though she was laboring in rough seas, she was still making about 4 or 5 knots, which was considered very good considering the conditions. Still, the storm was growing in power, though there was little by way of official classifications at the time. The storm that the Evening Star found herself in was later referred to as a hurricane. At about 10 at night, the first true disaster struck. A huge wave suddenly struck the ship and her port quarter, which smashed into one of the sailors with such force that his arm was broken. The impact also caused the rudder chain to be knocked from its groove. With the rudder no longer functioning, the ship immediately fell into a trough, and the waves began to crash over the Evening Star with force. It would take an hour for a repair to be made to the rudder and for the helm to be lashed into place, but the engines were not strong enough to bring her from the trough she had fallen into in the fury of the storm. It was noted later by investigators that no drag or sails were employed to attempt to bring her around to a better position. The only attempt was made with the helm and engines. It is possible that, by now, the crew was too distracted with other matters, especially since they were, as previously mentioned, short-handed, and many of those who were employed were inexperienced. The ship had remained fairly free of water for the hour that the crew was employed with the rudder chain. The hull remained watertight in spite of the strain, and the waves that were crashing over the ship were being managed with the ship's pumps. Right around the time that the rudder chain was repaired, however, a forward gangway on the starboard side of the ship was stove in, and the water came pouring in. The purser and the boatswain organized what members of the crew who were not otherwise occupied, as well as volunteers from among the passengers, to try to block the breach. They used everything at their disposal, including mattresses and doors from around the ship. This was the best that they could manage, since the Evening Star did not have a carpenter or lumber stores, but it proved to be ineffective, and the makeshift blockade was eventually abandoned, it being decided that it would be more effective to begin bailing. Unfortunately, the water rushing in through the opening began to pour into the engine room, endangering the ship even further. The bailing crew was forced to rush to focus on the engine room specifically, abandoning other areas that were also filling with water, in an effort to keep the ship going. The ship began wallowing more as the weight of the water took its toll, as did the shifting cargo. At some point, acknowledging the inevitability of the situation, it was reported that Captain Knapp had gone into the main cabin and announced to the passengers that were gathered there that the ship was going down, and that they should all do what they could to save themselves. At about 3 a.m, under the strain, one of the steam pipes began to leak. With the steam pipe went the ship's auxiliary donkey engine and boiler, but the engine crew did not immediately abandon their posts. For the next 2 hours, the engine crew kept the engines going in a desperate fight until the steam leak became so bad that the engine crew was barely able to enter the room at intervals. The steam powering the ship was so diminished that it was no longer possible for the ship to have any headway at all, and at 5 a.m, the fires were abandoned and went out. Up until that moment, the ship's chief engineer had refused to leave his post and had done everything possible to keep the engine going. But now that it had completely stopped, the attention of everyone turned to the idea of abandoning ship. Everyone could feel the Evening Star settling beneath their feet. The launching of the lifeboats and how they were equipped would later be met with the heaviest scrutiny. The Evening Star had 6 Ingersoll lifeboats, as well as a single wooden boat for general use. This was as much as was required by law at the time, though it was not even close to being enough for everyone on the ship to escape. The equipment for launching the boats, the inexperienced crews to launch the boats, and the equipment in the lifeboats, however, were all found to be wanting. The lifeboats had all been cut loose when it was realized the ship was sinking, and some of the ladies, as well as 2 or 3 of the men, had gotten into one of the boats. But almost as soon as the boat had hit the rough seas, it had capsized, and everyone in it was lost. This made them reluctant to attempt the launching of the other lifeboats, which remained on the deck full of passengers who had crowded into them. The ship's purser, Mr. Allen, had taken charge of seeing the women from the cabin into the boats, and had provided a few of them with the several lifebelts the Evening Star had on board. Though some of the crew members had also found places on the boats, it was reported that none of the officers made the attempt. By now, the Evening Star had been pounded to pieces by the waves, to the extent that she was missing one of her paddle boxes, and no one could believe that she would remain afloat for much longer. Their fears were realized when, at 6 a.m, she finally surrendered and sank beneath them. The ship going down had the effect of launching lifeboats, which had already been cut loose and were full of people, but the moment they touched the rough seas, they were all swamped or capsized. Soon only 3 of the boats remained above water. Purser Allen would report that he had been floating among the wreckage and driftwood of the sunken Evening Star for about half an hour before he had found one of the ship's lifeboats drifting nearby and had pulled himself into it. Even after this, he had been thrown into the water 6 more times as the boat was capsized by the waves repeatedly. His experience was shared by Chief Engineer Robert Finger, who had also found himself in the water before finding the lifeboat and climbing aboard. Initially, those clinging to or inside of the lifeboat numbered 20, but as it upturned repeatedly, their number was eventually reduced to 10. Chief Engineer Finger estimated that at one point, after being thrown from the boat, he had spent 6 or 7 hours floating on a piece of driftwood until he had been able to regain the boat. No one was entirely certain of their position, and at about midnight, Captain Knapp had told Purser Allen that they were about 240 miles northeast of Matanillia Reef. But after that, no one had paid much attention to their location as they fought against the storm. With no destination in mind, the boat just drifted. It was only as night fell that the storm finally began to calm, and they could rest a little. October the 4th dawned with good weather, and around 8 a.m, they came across another lifeboat. This one containing the third mate, as well as 8 others. With the weather good, the purser's boat made 2 sails out of the 4 of the life preservers, while the third mate's boat was fortunate enough to still have a sail on board. The 2 boats kept company through the day, but as night fell they lost sight of one another. At 5 a.m, on October the 5th, the purser's boat encountered the bark Fleetwing of Norway, which spotted them and picked them up. On the 6th, the Fleetwing encountered the S.J. Waring, which had also been damaged in the storm. Due to his ship's condition, he was headed towards the nearest port to them, Savannah, Georgia. As a result, it was decided to transfer the survivors of the Evening Star to the S.J. Waring, where they reported that they had been met with extreme hospitality. Though the purser did not know it, the third mate's boat had made an even more difficult journey in the storm than they had. Third mate Fitzpatrick had not originally been the highest officer in the boat. That honor had been held by Captain Knapp, who had been able to climb aboard after the ship had gone down just like the rest of them. But while the purser's boat had capsized 6 times at most, those in third mate Fitzpatrick's boat estimated that they had capsized as many as 15 times, and the 6th time, Captain Knapp had not returned. Though 16 people had started on this boat from the wreck, it would be only 6, as well as the remains of 2 others that arrived in the boat at Fernandina Beach, Florida, on the 7th of October. Of the survivors who were still in the boat, only a single passenger remained. The others had succumbed to the lack of food or water. The passenger who survived, Frank Gerard, had his leg crushed and his nose broken by the ordeal, and would be the first to say that his life had been in danger, but he still mustered the strength to report to the authorities that the sailors on the lifeboat with him had pocketed the valuables of one of the other passengers who had passed away on the boat, and ensure that they made it to his family. Purser Allen confidently told the newspapers that he was certain that there would be no other survivors, and certainly none of the female passengers could have survived the conditions that they had suffered. He was fortunately incorrect. There would be one more boat saved, this one rescued by the schooner, the Morning Star. They were delivered to Charleston on October 9th, the day after Purser Allen's confident statement that there would be no other survivors. There were no reports of this boat repeatedly capsizing, and on board was the ship's pilot, the cook, the assistant engineer, and 4 passengers, including 2 women. Out of the 250 passengers who had been on board the Evening Star, 7 had survived. Such devastation immediately caught public interest and outrage. As the theaters in Paris mourned the loss of their own and marched from the theater to the church for a solemn memorial mass in the United States, the public began to look for where to place the blame. People made allegations about the competency of Captain Knapp, which were soon dismissed due to the large number of people who had sailed with him stepping forward to his defense. Allegations would be made against the effectiveness of the Ingersoll lifeboats, but that was difficult to prove when, as a demonstration, an Ingersoll lifeboat had crossed the Atlantic unassisted only a couple of months before, making it the smallest vessel to have ever made the crossing. Others attacked the safety of the Evening Star itself, stating that she was an unseaworthy vessel that had been condemned 6 months before but still allowed to sail, or that she had been given a clean bill of health by inspectors when she had clearly been more damaged than previously believed when she had gone aground on the reef. In the face of public outrage, an investigation did indeed take place. With so much of the attention on whether or not the Steamship Inspector of New York had done their job, the services of the Steamship Inspector of California, who happened to be visiting the East Coast, were called upon. He paid the utmost minute attention to the construction of the Evening Star, showing piece by piece how well constructed she had been, and the careful repairs that had gone into her after the reef, as well as questioning and then vindicating the Steamship Inspector of New York. Instead, the investigation laid the blame completely at the feet of the New York Mail Steamship Company, and told the other owners of steamships to avoid making the same mistakes. Though nothing that the company had done was illegal, the insufficient safety equipment had proven deadly. Even more deadly, though, was the small and inexperienced crew. While the ship was still operating completely within the law, it was the belief of the inspector that if she had her regular 70 crew members, and they were experienced, the Evening Star could have been saved. Captain Knapp was a good captain, and he probably knew what needed to be done, but he had not been given the people that he would have needed to save his ship, and it had cost over 250 lives. For more information, please see the New York Times from November 11th, 1866, or see our other sources in the description below. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.